All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I'm creating a series of video presentations that are based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. We're into server-side website programming, Express Web Framework, Node.js-JavaScript, and we're in part 6 of the 7-part series on working with forms. So we have done the intro, creating the skeleton website, using a database with Mongoose, routes and controllers, and displaying our library data. So it's time to go into working with forms. And you'll notice if you take a look at it, that once we get into it, there will be 6 different forms that we have to worry about. Creating a genre, creating an author, creating a book, and creating a book instance, deleting an author, and updating a book object. All right, so let's just jump right into it then. In this tutorial, we'll show you how to work with HTML forms and Express using Pug. In particular, we'll discuss how to write forms to create, update, and delete documents. So the C, U, and D part of CRUD from the site's database. You already know this, but an HTML form is a group of one or more fields, also known as widgets, on a web page used to collect information that a user submits and sends it off to a server. Forms, as mentioned there, are a flexible mechanism for collecting user input because they've got everything from text boxes to check boxes to radio buttons to date pickers. And even with the text boxes, there's different kinds. So there's email, password, etc. They're a relatively secure way of sharing data with the server, and they allow us to send data in post requests, which again will help keep from different types of things like cross-site scripting, etc. Working with forms can be complicated. Developers need to write HTML for the form, validate and properly sanitize entered data on the server, and possibly also in the browser. You really should do both, but of course it must be done on the server. Repost the form with error messages to inform user of invalid fields. Handle the data when successfully submitted, and finally respond to the user to indicate that they were successful. In this tutorial, we're going to show you how to do the above operations in Express. Along the way, we'll extend the local library website to allow users to create, edit, and delete items from the library. It says there we haven't looked at how to restrict particular routes to authenticated and authorized users. So at this point, any user will be able to make any changes. And that's an important point. In other words, we don't have a true administrator. Okay? All right, first a brief overview of HTML forms. They show one in here. And a couple things, let's see. The action, this is going to go out to, as it says, the team name URL and try to find probably an index.html file in there. It will be a post. There will be a label that will say enter name and an ID of team name. It will be a text field named name field. All right, and it'll say default name for your team, and there'll be a submit button. Now, a couple things to note in here that are different from what we've done in the past. First of all, notice that the ID is not the same as the name. They don't have to be. In the past, we've always made them the same because we haven't been doing anything with server-side form programming. Now we will. All right. While here we have included just one text field for entering the team name, a form may contain any number of input elements and their associated labels. The type attribute considers what sort of widget will be displayed and what's expected as well. The name and ID fields are used to identify the field in JavaScript, CSS, HTML. Again, the ID is more on the client side, the name is more on the server side. Value defines the initial value for the field when it's first displayed. The submit input will be displayed as a button by default. This can be pressed by the user to upload the data contained by the other elements to the server. The form attributes define the HTTP method used. In this case, again, it's a post. Well, remember, action is basically the file that you want the form to be sent to, for lack of better words. If you put in either an empty string or a hashtag, it won't be sent anywhere, but it'll be rather submitted back to the current page. And remember, we've got a post method, which, as it says, should always be used if the data is going to result in a change to the database, and a get when we're grabbing information. Form handling, as mentioned there, uses all the same techniques that we have learned for displaying information about our models. The route request sends the request to the controller function, which performs any database action required, including reading data from the models, then generates and returns an associated HTML page. What makes things more complicated is that the server needs to be able to process the data provided by the user, redisplay the form with error information if there are any problems. So they show you a process flow chart of everything that's going on in here. I think they've done a pretty good job of actually explaining it, but I'll leave that up there for just a second. All right. As shown in the diagram, the main things that the form handling code needs to do are display the default form the first time it's requested by the user. As it says, it may contain blank fields. Receive the data submitted by the user, usually in terms of a post request. Validate the form and sanitize it. Validating meaning that if it's asking for numbers, you've got numbers in there. And sanitizing meaning that, again, you want to make sure that you don't allow things like any JavaScript tags or anything in form fields. If all the data is valid, you want to perform the required actions. This could involve saving the data in the database, sending a notification email, returning the results of a search, etc. And once all actions are complete, you want to redirect the user to a new page. All right. Often form handling is implemented using a get for the initial display of the form in a post when you want to handle the validation and processing. This is the approach that they're going to use here. Express itself does not provide any support for form handling operations, but it can use middleware to process post and get parameters. As far as validation and sanitization, before the data from a form is stored, it must be validated and sanitized. I've already mentioned this, but let's say it again. Validation checks that entered values are appropriate for each field, that they're range appropriate, format appropriate, etc., and that values have indeed been supplied for all required fields. Sanitation removes or replaces characters that might be potentially used to send malicious content to the server. For this tutorial, they're going to use the Express Validator. So as you can see, we're going to have to do an npm install on that. We left that up before. And because we haven't done this before, but this is the Express Validator. So let's validate that indeed we don't have it in our package.json file right now. There is no Express. There is Express, but there's no Express Validator. Now I'm going to close this because otherwise I get a warning that it's changed. So let's come in here, put that in, hit enter. All right, we've got that. Now let's bring this up again and see if we've got our Express Validator. And you notice that indeed, yes, we do. All right, good. So far, so good. We will use these Express Validator to perform both validation and sanitization. So we just installed it. The Express Validator guide on GitHub provides a good overview of the API. And if you've never done this before, yes, it's GitHub, but as it says, it's got a basic guide and it's linked up the wazoo here too. To use the validator in our controllers, we specify that the particular functions we want to import from the module as shown below. There are many functions available allowing you to check and sanitize data from request parameters, body headers, etc., or all of them at once. For this tutorial, we'll primarily be using body and validation result. All right. The functions are defined as below. Notice the body specifies a set of fields in the request body, a post parameter, to validate and or sanitize along with an optional error message that can be displayed if it fails the test. The validation and sanitize criteria are daisy-chained to the body method. For example, the line below, they're checking the name field, and that validation error will set an error message, empty name. We then call the sanitization method trim to remove any white space from the beginning and ending of the string, and then the is length to make sure it isn't empty, so that it's got a minimum of 1. Finally, we call the escape to remove any HTML characters from the variable that might be used in JavaScript for malicious purposes. This test checks the age field, is a valid date, and uses optional to specify that null and empty strings will not fail validation. You can also daisy chain different validators and add messages that are displayed if the preceding validations are true. Other than body, there's validation result. As it says, it runs the validation, making errors available in the form on a validation request object. This is invoked in a separate callback as shown in here. We use the validation results is empty method to check if there were errors, and its array error method so we can get the set of the errors if there's more than one, of course, or one or more. The validation sanitization chains are middleware that should be passed to the express route handler. We'll do this indirectly via the controller. When the middleware runs, each validator sanitizer is run in the order specified. We'll cover some real examples when we implement them below. All right, so we're almost to there. All right, many of the models in the library are related dependent. For example, a book requires an author and may also have one or more genres. This raises the question of how we should handle a case where the user wishes to create an object when its related objects do not yet exist. In other words, for example, a book where the author object hasn't been defined. Also, can we, to delete an object that is still being used by another object. For example, deleting a genre that is still being used by a book. For this project, we will simplify the implementation by stating that a form can only create an object using objects that already exist, and delete an object if it's not being referenced by other objects. They do mention, as it says there, a more robust implementation might allow you to change or create the dependent objects when creating a new object, and delete any object at any time. All right. In order to implement our route handling, we need two routes that have the same URL pattern. The first will be the get to display the new empty form. The second will be the post used for validating data entered by the user and then saving the information and doing the redirect. We have already created the routes for all of our pages in the routes catalog. So we've got these things in here already. So next we're going to have 6 subarticles that'll take us through the process of adding the forms that are shown below. All right. When we're done, they want us to implement the delete pages for book, book instance, and genre, linking them to the associated detail pages in the same way as we did the author delete. So we're going to do the create for the for, we're going to do the delete, and then we're asked to ourselves do the other 3 deletes. All right, and it says they do the same approach, and it gives you some hints and some tips. All right, and when we get done with that, that'll get us to deploying for production. So let's jump into create genre form. All right, we'll start on that in the next lecture.